very quick introduction from me. My name's Richard Edwards. I'm the politics reporter for BBC Radio York and Politics North. Very busy time at the minute. This has been a welcome little fire break because the last week I've been absolutely flat to the floor covering the Selby and Ainsty by-election, which is great fun. And it's in my backyard, so I've hit the jackpot. An election in the summer in the town that I live. But it's great to be here with you. It's lovely to be invited and to speak about a subject that I'm massively passionate about, which is poverty and the cost of living. I've been a journalist for 25 years and I've seen some seriously shocking things. All of that time has been in the north of England, but also with some time spent working abroad. And yes, stuff I've seen abroad has been a real eye-opener, but stuff I've seen here in our wonderful county of North Yorkshire is an eye-opener too. So what we're going to do is I want to hear some personal experiences and thoughts, but also we're going to be looking and discussing and debating possible solutions too. So what I'm going to do is do a quick introduction to the panel, but the people who are best placed to tell them about themselves are the panelists themselves. So one by one, they'll do a couple of minutes to tell you a bit about who they are and what they want to talk about today. So one by one, well, next to me here is Ian Wenman. Ian's from York. Hi, Ian. I loved the way Ian introduced me to himself. He compared his family to The Simpsons, and they're a 5-strong family. Dad worked, Mum didn't, and Ian tells me, a little bit like what I mentioned there as well, he first saw severe poverty when he was on a trip to South Asia, and since done a lot of work in York with the Peasholme project and outreach work on York Street. So I'm looking forward to hearing some detail from Ian. In the middle we have Sian Balsom from Healthwatch York. Sian and her brilliant team do an amazing job really forensically digging in to some of patients and people's experience of the healthcare system, the difficulties they can have getting the healthcare they need. Really important stuff you've done on dentistry, particularly, Sian. Some of the stories there, I'm not making this up. I was out doing a story about dentistry, and I spoke to a bloke who said that he deliberately committed a crime so he could go to prison to get his teeth seen to, because the last time he'd had his teeth fixed was when he was in jail. I mean, that's madness, isn't it? And on the end there, we have Tom Clark, who's a fellow of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, recently published a book called Broke. It sounds really, really interesting. Some proper testimony by expert voices of lived experience of poverty. Photos look very striking too. I'm looking forward to reading it. And it's been praised by Alan Johnson, acclaimed author and former big-hitting politician who gets his hair cut at the same barbers in Selby that I do. There you go. Right, so, ladies and gentlemen, your panel. Right, so one by one, let's let the panel introduce themselves. Ian, are you okay to kick off? There we go. Ian Wenman for you.
Hi, good afternoon everyone. Nice to see you all. I'm checking in a little bit nervous, but that's all right. So, you referenced The Simpsons. So, why was I mentioning that? So there was a time, I don't know if you're familiar with The Simpsons, where we watched Homer be the only worker in the family and was able to sustain running a home. And we didn't think that was odd. And that was the reality as I grew up, that my dad used to work and my mum did some part-time work. But back then, that was quite ordinary. And then if you fast forward it 40 odd years, I see during the pandemic, there was people on furlough, and it was taking two incomes to run a basic tenancy, and there was a tsunami of new poverty. People that we were working with in food banks, and the shame around the hidden food poverty, and we saw all sorts, and it brought poverty into a much broader spectrum of people. I'm improvising because I'm down to minute slots really. A bit longer.
Keep going, mate.
A bit longer. I am privileged that I work as a support worker, and I do outreach on the streets, and I go in and try and broker relationships with people who are struggling and or new to the difficult world, where people they are the shame around the different forms of poverty find it difficult to reach out. So I do feel privileged that I'm allowed to try and broker conversations and find solutions, which is, I think, we're all here to talk about the broader conversations of how we can meet in the middle to find solutions. In my vast speech, which I prepared here, one of the things I wanted to reference was how over the last decade or so, the internet has polarized us, and the right have become more right, the left more left, and there are so few opportunities to meet in the middle and have broader conversations. So I just wanted to acknowledge the space that's been provided by Ben and the team here. And you know, whilst this is a serious conversation, I think that the lightness that people bring is the starting point, our commonality and our empathy with each other. So I'm really open to the chat, and I hope to hear back from you all. Shall I pass it to you?
Smashing it, no, down to Sian, please.
Now,
Thanks,
over to Sian.
Ladies and gentlemen.
Okay, hi everybody. Yes, I'm Sian Balsom. I'm from Healthwatch York, and I have the immense privilege of leading a team who do all the hard work, so I get to go out and talk about it. And recently, part of the work we've been doing has been looking at the cost of living and the impacts on people's health. We've done 2 surveys about it. We've had 200 responses each time, all based on people living in the city, so only from York. And a colleague described it to me. She sent it out to her networks, and she said the first report was like being at the roller coaster before it sets off, and our second report is when it's in free fall. And that's where we feel we are at the moment with the cost of living in York, that everybody has this perception of York as a relatively affluent city, and yet 40% of the respondents to our second survey said they weren't able to heat their homes. 40% of the respondents to our survey said they were skipping meals or reducing the size of meals. We've heard from people who can no longer afford the food they need for their specialist diet. We've heard from people who are no longer going out, who are no longer socialising. I'm not going to read some of the quotes that I have previously read about our reports because I make myself cry, which is a little bit mortifying when you're supposed to be presenting stuff. But I would say if you haven't read it, and if you want to understand what people's lives are like right now in this city, please do read it, and hopefully you can cry by yourself at home and then think about what we can all do to make it better. And at that, I'll stop and hand you over to Tom.
Thank you very much. Nothing wrong with the cry. It's important. It's really important. Thanks, Sian. And then Tom Clark, author and fellow at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation.
Thank you very much. I think maybe the best way to bring out the urgency of the poverty crisis is to tell you just a few things that we didn't know when we published this book 2 months ago, but we do know now. Just to give you a sense of the rate at which the freefall that Sian's talking about is playing out. Okay, so rough sleeping, the hardest of the hard end of poverty, if you like, actually sleeping on the park bench, whatever. On the government's figures, that was up by 1/4 in the last year alone. Trussell Trust Food Bank reported it had given out 3 million food parcels last year, which is worse than in what you'll all remember was meant to be the darkest hour of the pandemic. Things got a bit better after the pandemic, and then they've got worse than they were in the middle of the pandemic now. There's also 1 million more people slipping below the government's headline poverty measure. Again, this is since the book came out. Like normally authors sit here and go, I tell you X, Y, and Z out of my book, but no, this is new stuff, right? And I could go on. There's indebtedness, there's malnutrition, there's queues at the doors of crisis centres. First, women and now men are dying earlier in poorer parts of England. So all of these are kind of demonstrable facts, and facts that should be explosive. Each one of them should be explosive about the country that's slipping backwards in ways that we wouldn't have thought it might do. And yet, statistics don't move people in the way that stories do, in the way that the kind of quotes that Sian's talking about, you have to dig into and see what it actually looks like from the inside. And we saw that, I think, precisely a year ago when a 77-year-old widow called Elsie rang up ITV's Good Morning Britain to solicit any advice that the then Prime Minister might have about dealing with her plight. It was duly explained to Boris Johnson, if you remember him, that Elsie only ate 1 meal a day and spent her days going round on the bus because that meant she wouldn't have to turn on the heating at home. And suddenly the Prime Minister, any of these statistics I read out, he would been very good at kind of just say, oh, cheer up, come on, not as bad as all that. But he was savvy enough to clock that he couldn't tell Elsie that her own account of her day-to-day life was an inverted pyramid of piffle or whatever it might be. And so instead he squirmed and then came up with the answer, well, look, it's thanks to my government's decisions that Elsie's got a freedom pass. That means she can stay on the bus all day. And you sort of sense that jaws drop nationwide. I have one or two of you, I think, remember this story. And it does just show how the individual testimony cuts through in a way that the statistics don't. So that's what we've been doing, channeling. We started on this project about the time Elsie dropped that bombshell, like the first-hand testimony, sending really good reporters into the places that it's so easy, not only for politicians, but any of us with prosperous lives to ignore, and open ears and find out what's going on. There's hope in there as well as despair. There's extraordinary stories of tenants, of workers fighting back, but that's what I'll be drawing on in our debate. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Just a couple of comments to summarise before I open it up to the floor. I think the point you made there about debt was a very interesting one, Tom, because debt is and can be all-consuming. I've done a lot of stories about this, and once people are in, they can find themselves in real cycles of debt from which they never escape. And I've heard of some really interesting dynamics and relationships going on with moneylenders. And it's wrong to portray the moneylenders and the loanees all as the loan sharks, because some people who need a loan do get looked after, and some very interesting relationships build up. I did a story about a woman who actually named her daughter after the bloke who lent her money because he was one of the good ones and did defer the payments until she got back on her feet. But sadly, there's too few of those, and there's so many unscrupulous moneylenders who really prey on people in difficult positions. So that is a real big part of the cost of living crisis, because people are more vulnerable. A couple of examples that I've seen recently, I was on a job in the Rainbow Centre in Scarborough, the brilliant work they do over there. Trish Kinsella, the then chief executive, she's retired since, took a phone call and had to break off the interview she was doing, and I could see that she was very animated, and it was because she was upstairs, so we were upstairs, food bank was downstairs. The food bank had run out of food with people still turning up to try and get some parcels, so they were asking for authorisation to use what tiny amount of funds they had to go and buy some baked beans. That's the reality of it. In York itself, the brilliant work that Hilary Platt and her team do at Belfarm Community Club. I did a piece from there when the local elections run in York. And it was the first time, and the word shame was mentioned by the panellist, and I've heard that word come through more recently, much more often than it ever has while I've been covering stories about poverty and the cost of living crisis. And I think for people who are prepared to talk about the shame they are feeling, and it's awful that they're feeling that, it's because they must be thinking, I'm in such a difficult place, I've got nothing less, let's just get it off my chest. And then a safe space as well, with the great work that Hilary does. So I noticed that. And then a final point as well, Tom, the lady mentioned on the buses, I might remember this incorrectly, but I think did some of my colleagues elsewhere in the media sort of pile on her afterwards and try and discredit her or something and claim that she didn't ride on the buses all day? Did that happen?
There was a little bit of that, but it died because she was able to evidence that it was true. I mean, there is a kind of partisan element in the media that will just, one of Boris Johnson's critics is out today saying that when she said Boris Johnson might not always be telling the truth, Boris Johnson's friend said, she's bitter because he had an affair with her, and that got printed as a news story, but it turned out to be complete rubbish. So these things happen.
Isn't it odd that an old lady can't go on a programme and say I ride around the buses all day without being held up to some sort of scrutiny? Bizarre. I prefer to concentrate my journalism elsewhere. Anyway, that's enough. Thank you for those observations. Very, very interesting. Let's open up to the floor then. My friend has got the microphone. Who would like to either make the first contribution, make the first observation, or ask the first question of the panel?
Hello. So my name's Dan. I'm from Liverpool. I'm a doctor working in Hull. I was very fortunate to have gone to an independent school on a scholarship, and so I live in two very different worlds. One where my family, where I'm the first person to have gone to university, and in a very and unfortunately a very underprivileged family. And then in another world where there is unlimited privilege with people who I went to school with, a lot of the professionals who I work with come from very privileged backgrounds, and I often find it very, very difficult to explain the lived experience in this dichotomy in which I exist. And since I've moved from Liverpool, I live in Pocklington at the moment, which is fairly privileged. I again find it very difficult. I find it very difficult to transition to living in Yorkshire, where it is a very different economic and political situation. So I guess my question to the panel is, with those difficulties in mind, how do you communicate how difficult it is for people who are living in such underprivileged circumstances at the moment, and what can we as individuals do to, I don't know, help the cause, I guess?
Thank you for the question. I'm not sure how to answer it, but when I was looking at poverty in its broader sense, I made the note of lack of access to education was one of the things, and also a lack of participation in decision making. So it's the old 80-20, that the 20% of the people. So access to education is very much around money. As someone also with lived experience and an interesting and sometimes difficult background, for myself, all I can do is present as me and keep my side of the street clean, so to speak, and know that I am as welcome and entitled as any other human being to participate. And if I come across unwelcoming attitudes, that is not my fault or my problem, and you are so entitled and welcome, or you should be, in any scenario that you choose to be. As to how we carry that to the broader system, I don't know, but I think that we the beautiful thing about improvising is not I, but this young man will pass you the mic.
Thank you. I'm Ali Bodley, and I run something called the Poverty Truth Commission, and we do it in York. It's going on nationwide though, and we take people with lived experience of poverty, we build them as a team and get them to share their poverty, and then we find people in position of power and influence, like the new leader of the council, and invite them to become civic commissioners, and they spend time getting to know each other initially and really forming strong relationships, and then they work out what they want to change and they change it together. And that is something that's going on in York at the moment. We're just beginning the actual starting of working with the civic commissioners. But also, as there's so much I want to say, your point about food banks, I know people who are too ashamed to go to food banks. They are starving because they will not go. So actually the need on food banks is massive compared to what it actually is. And stigma is a massive thing. And that's one thing people could do, is actually think about people and how you approach people. And if they say they're in poverty or something that's related to it, treat them as individuals, treat them as human beings, which is again what the Poverty Truth Commission is all about, and empowering people and getting people to work together to change things for everyone, really.
Brilliant, Ali. Thank you for that. And then give me a shout and I'll come and talk to you about it when I'm not covering this on the by-election. I'm really interested.
Well,
Excellent. Sian.
I wanted to say, I wasn't going to say all of that, but I am lucky enough, as Healthwatch York is based in York CVS, I get to see the great work that Ali's doing. And I think that is part of it, is making sure those stories, those voices are captured and heard, but also put in positions where they can influence power. And bringing that power together from the reality of people's lives to the people who have the power to change it. I think there is a massive role for the media in this. I think actually the shame we should feel is not understanding poverty. The shame we should feel is living comfortably with that. if we have enough ourselves. And I'm not suggesting for 1 second everyone in this room does, because I think the reality of poverty in the UK now is quite interesting. But it has become more people's experience, and yet it is still relatively hidden in the media. And I would also say capturing people's stories, continuing to share them, and continuing to react to them as human beings is the best way to continue to think we can't accept this. Things have to change.
Hi, my name's Joanna. I don't work in any healthcare or social community line of work. I'm just interested. And 2 points. One about the media. I don't know if you will remember these awful programs like Benefit Street and stuff like that. And I remember thinking when they first came onto the telly, like, how can this be drama? How can they make TV programs about people's plights like that? I mean, and there are people, they just watch it to have a good laugh, So that's shaped the psychology and the way people look at people who are, in difficult circumstances. So that will feed into people not wanting to admit that they are, won't it? So we need to change that. We need to shame the people who make programs like that. And the other thing was the thread going through a lot of things I've been to today. There was one of them talking about levelling up and, education and skilling up the youngsters. That's all good and well. But if you don't get to go to a good school, you don't get that. And for me, levelling up isn't like putting a swimming pool into a town. Levelling up should be making sure people have a proper wage so they can decide if they want to go swimming, if they decide if they want to have a pork chop or halal, whatever, that they have that choice. If you haven't got the money, you can't make choices. And it's poverty. I don't know why they gave you the graveyard. It should have been early this morning, because that's what's just permeated the whole thing today, has been underfunding in the NHS, underfunding in schools, which has fundamentally led to broken Britain. I don't want to go home, send everybody home in a bad mood, but that is it. We're all here for a reason, not for the same reason. But so we need to find people, you good people who work in this community, who are going to feed into the politician or the people who are going to make the next government, and they have to realise they've got to invest in schools, and some things need to be taken out of the private sector, like the probation service, the care system. That's just led to the focus being on profit and not people. So that's my rant.
Thank you, Joanna. You're quite right about poverty. It takes away people's choices.
Yeah.
It really does. Tom.
Okay, so I'll just try and draw some of that together in terms of the angle around consciousness raising. How do you do this, and also how do you bring out those voices, because they're such linked topics. The low point for me on the media wasn't actually Benefit Street. It was a programme on Channel 5 called Gypsies on Benefits and Proud. That was the name of the programme. And in that context, we've got someone in the book, an extreme asthmatic who was on benefits, and gave us a very detailed account of how she ended up in intensive care with her heart having stopped after she had to lie on the floor, and because she couldn't work and she was on these benefits, and then the bedroom tax kicked in, and the story, no one would read that story and not feel moved. But of course the difficulty is in teasing out those stories and getting people to feel comfortable about sharing those stories in a world of gypsies on benefits and proud. Okay, so how do you do it? 3 thoughts. First of all, politics. There's been a great drive of, whatever you'd call it, diversity, equality and diversity, inclusion, kind of targeting representativeness in different dimensions, particularly, say, in the Parliamentary Labour Party now, more than half women. But what's happened to the percentage of people in the Parliamentary Labour Party with direct experience of poverty? It's gone down. Okay, so we need to do something about that. We need to say, actually, the voices that are being cut out of power, and we need to monitor that as energetically as we do with gender and race and sexuality. Journalism, second thing, is what do we do about the fact it's hard to get people to share those stories? If we've got good committed journalists who want to do it, you've got to build trust. okay, because it's painful and difficult to open up about being broke. And so I did it myself once. I tried to, when it was a credit crunch, you know, go and interview people, stick a microphone of people on the way out of the job centre. And guess what? It doesn't work, you know, because people have just been probed and prodded by officialdom. You've caught them at a moment of vulnerability, and you sort of say, well, can you tell us about what your experience is like at the moment? People don't want to know. So, you know, you've got to find ways in. For example, in the book, we've got this guy, Daniel Trilling, who's just been nominated for the Orwell Prize for his chapter, and he worked with the migrants' rights charities who had helped people get visas, helped people regularise their status. So he went in through that route and said, you know, you can trust me. So they weren't then suspicious. We had a disabled person reporting on the plight of disabled people. So these things, so that people can see that you identify with them in their time, and you're not just doing a quick vox pop, which can be edited and misused. You're sitting down with them over a cup of tea for an hour and giving them a time of day, and then you'll get the story. And then I think you can change the consciousness. And the final thing is not for journalists, not for politicians, but just for all of us to reflect, first of all, on how the difference is. You know, there are these trapdoors in life that any of us can fall through: sickness, divorce, you know, different problems that hit people, and then we might need help. So think about that, and then live your life in a way that means that you ensure that you don't, and this is only addressed to the people who are more privileged, is make sure that you don't only mix with other people who are more privileged, have friends who walk different paths in life, and that will make a huge difference.
Thank you. So I'll just summarise that briefly, then go back to the floor. Some really interesting points there. Context is everything. My approach has always been, let people tell the stories, but Tommy's exactly right there. If it becomes a very quick vox pop that you might even lose control of once it's fed back into the studio, then we as the reporters become part of the problem. It's about relationships, and that's why local reporters working their patches and building the contacts up, building the relationships up, are so important. And you've got to go back, and once that trust is put in you, you make sure you repay, and you don't just disappear and never be seen again. You go back and you go back and you go back, and then people will tell you more and more and more. So that is absolutely essential. Have you heard, as well as a phrase about, because you've got Benefit Street, there was another programme as well, it was just the third one. One of them was in my hometown, Stockton-on-Tees, and there was fury about it. And it, how can I put it? That's the phrase, thanks Sian. Yeah, have anyone heard that phrase before? Yeah. Now, we are well aware of that, and me and my colleagues in the political unit at the BBC have spoken about that a lot, and how we have to work very hard to avoid being guilty of it. And then, Dan, this might chime with you a little bit. Great to you mentioned Pocklington, actually. That's where I started out, on the Pocklington Post, met my missus. Incredibly still with her, 25 years later. I don't know I'm getting away with it. The BBC's had a difficulty. Tom, you touched on this. In that it has been, and to a point still is, an elitist organisation. And my own background has helped me in the work that I have done and continue to do. But the BBC is trying, and there's an organisation within it called Raised, which is to better represent employees of working class backgrounds, but has got an agreement with the Director General now that there will be a proportion of people from working class backgrounds represented within the BBC. Now, that's only my own organisation, but I'm glad progress is being made there. Well, let's see where we go with it. So hopefully some of that helps answer your question, Dan. It was a really good one. Any more questions, thoughts or observations? Oh, of course, Sian.
I'd also just like to come in on the poverty porn issue. And I think one of the real things that we must avoid is the current ask from people who find themselves in elevated positions and then go, take me somewhere and show me people living in poverty, because I want to understand. But actually, you know, it's not tourism. We're not going around to spy on people's lives. And if we're then going home and thinking, what am I doing with that information? And if the answer is nothing, then don't go and visit. And if you really want to go and volunteer, go and turn up. Find a good reason to be in that space and engage with people. That's a much better relationship rather than show me some poor folk. Thanks.
Well, That's grotesque, Sian, isn't it? That and that is what I would compare to a journalist going to do a vox pop and then never going back there again. And can you imagine why on earth would anyone want to share such sensitive information about their lives with someone they never met before who's going to disappear in 5 minutes from their community? So spot on, Sian. It's a really good comparison. So any more thoughts, questions, observations from the floor? Of course. Oh, if you use that mic, and then after that, Councillor Stephen Fenton's has got a question for us. Let me just give the mic to the panel. There you go.
Sure, if it's inappropriate pay to ask, but it's, I know statistically, if you have a disability, you're much more likely to be in poverty. So what is being done in this city to help disabled people to increase their standard of living?
We did do a bit of research on this last year at the Joseph Roundtree, and what we found is particularly at single disabled people, obviously that if you're in a couple and one of them's earning, and obviously work with disabled people, but even just if we look at single disabled people, the odds of them being behind on their bills was 5 times as high, I think it was. The odds of them being struggling to keep the house adequately warm was 8 times as high as for the general population, and the odds of missing meals and that sort of thing was 10 times. So I couldn't really believe those numbers, but there we are. It's not a solution, that one, but that is, just backing up what you say.
I don't have the solution, I wish I did, but I think part of the problem is that there has been an erosion of people's rights in terms of access to healthcare, in terms of access to work, in terms of a welfare system that picks people up when things go wrong. We've recently done some work for the council, haven't got the report yet because they have to publish it before I can publish our bit. But it was talking to people who got themselves into difficulties financially following issues with council tax benefits. And the current system is, if they get into difficulties, they have to be taken to court to get things put in place to sort it out. And everyone knows that is the worst thing we could do to people. And we had one-to-one conversations with individuals about their experience of the process and what they thought about it, and unsurprisingly, nobody likes it. But what was really startling for us were the number of people who were doing okay, then fell ill, and maybe acquired a long-term health condition or became a disabled person. And I think there is a huge amount we need to do in terms of genuinely understanding what minimum income standard looks like for anybody in this country and making sure everybody has access to that minimum income. And then we have to think about what additional costs do disabled people incur, if it's specialist food, if it's mobility issues where you cannot use the bus to get around. And I think the best way for us to properly understand that is engaging with people living in poverty and with disabled people about what you need to live a decent life in this country. And then we need to put in place the measures to make that happen. So I'd love to see a minimum income standard, and I'd love to see adjustments made to make sure that disabled people do not have to live in poverty. And the children growing up in those households are not growing up in poverty because they have a disabled parent. That's what I'd like to see.
To listen to people's stories, isn't it? We've got a question from Stephen in the middle there.
I think it's clear from what we've heard that a lot of good work is being done to shine a light on the issues and to document and to demonstrate the seriousness of the issue. There's arguably, and I'm sure it's a frustration that the panel have in terms of how that information is used and acted on. So is it a case of a bespoke piece of work such as the Poverty Truth Commission? What would the panel like to see kind of hardwired into the system so that the evidence and the personal stories that are being gathered will actually meaningfully lead to change, whether that's nationally or regionally or elsewhere?
Yeah, I can do bits and bobs in this answer. So quite often, I wear a couple of different hats here. So I'm also part of a lived experience group, and we, with the help of people from Healthwatch, we run a participatory research cafe in town on a Tuesday afternoon, and it has given a voice and has been shaped by the people that use it. Then we also use different methodologies of talking to people about situations and how we could do things differently for better outcomes for them. And we've done commissioned work with the council, and rather than build something and that as an afterthought involve people who are going to be using that service, we try and get the voice of people who are using the system or with the lived experience of that system to help shape a better system moving forward. So that's one of the projects that we do. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Right.
Brilliant.
Absolutely agree around co-production. I think it is the future. And for those people who aren't aware what co-production means, it is not two blokes sat in a room doing something together, which I have heard other people in the NHS describing. Well, I got together with a bloke from the hospital and we came up with something. No, that's not co-production. Genuine co-production is working with the people who will be affected, the staff delivering things, the whole community around it, and getting to the heart of what does better actually look like. And a lot of the co-production that happens at the moment is with the people we like to engage with. We find it easy to engage with. If you're not engaging with everyone, forget it. It's not co-production. I would like to see equality impact assessments everywhere completed properly. Equality impact assessments are meant to be done when anything comes in, and you're meant to review how it impacts on people with particular protected characteristics. That, in most places, doesn't include people who are less well off. It doesn't include socioeconomic factors. York made a commitment years ago to include socioeconomic factors in their equality impact assessments, and I'd be really interested in revisiting that and seeing if that has changed the decisions we make as a city, and if it hasn't, can we start now? I think there's also something for me about the role of media and politics and how we keep kind of putting out a relentless tide of unignorable evidence. So I think one of the things that I'm currently annoying my team about, that I'd like us to think about, is how we bust the myth of the free NHS and the erosion of the rights that we had under the NHS in terms of, once upon a time, opticians were within the NHS, and some people still get free optical care, but not everyone. NHS dentistry, you will know, don't get me started. I could have taken the whole hour and some more about dentistry. I won't. But try and get an NHS dentist in York. If you are living in poverty and you can't afford a private dentist, you will just have to live with your toothache. That's the reality for people. The other myth of the NHS, I think, that we need to talk about is over-the-counter medicines and prescription charges, and there are loads of people who can't afford to buy the drugs over the counter and will no longer get them on prescription. And there are the issue of gluten-free food for people who are celiac or have other eating challenges, who cannot afford food, who used to get it on prescription and no longer do. So there are a lot of rights that people used to have, and I think pre-pandemic we weren't that worried about those rights. Post-pandemic, there are people struggling to survive who can't afford food that stops them being really, really unwell. The other thing I'd say is people keep talking about us having more NHS funding than ever before, and I think that's very debatable. A full fact check of that is required. But when the NHS is having to pick up people's heating costs in certain areas, when they're piloting that, and the welfare state is not supporting people properly, then of course we haven't got enough money in the NHS, because we are trying to solve a problem with it that should be a problem elsewhere, and we need that minimum income standard. So I keep coming back to that, but yes, systems need to respond to the relentless tide of evidence that shows us what we're doing is not working, and people are being left behind, and it's unacceptable.
I do have to mention that our colleague from Little Apple's brought in lots of copies of Broke. I've got to do it. All the royalties from that do go to Leeds Asylum Support Network. So it's a worthy cause if anyone's interested. And what the stories that are collected in that show really is that while not everything comes back to money, everything's made worse by not having enough money. So we've got people like Sophie in Manchester, like Lowry in Blackpool, like Yvonne in Tottenham, and their reluctance, these are people we meet at the food bank, to tell family and friends about the hunger that they face, distances them from the people who should be supporting them through their difficulties. So you can see how the poverty twists from one form, not enough money, into another of social isolation, or indeed tales of the empty days of Francis in Glasgow, which led him to seek comfort in drink, which in turn left him with too little money for the right food, too little iron in his body, and therefore too few healthy red blood cells. At every turn, poverty and deprivation twists into another form. Now, people who don't care about money will care about some of these things around isolation, about health, so we need to make those links. But then we need to come back to the money and say that while not everything's going to be sorted out by money, everything can be soothed if it's adequate instead of inadequate. And what Joseph Roundtree's been doing in combination with the Trussell Trust is campaigning for what it's calling an essentials guarantee. You know, for 8 of the 10 last years, we've broken the link between inflation and the basic rates of benefits. And so what we're doing is saying, let's just go back to what we think people actually need, not about anything of luxury, but the basic benefits, which might be like £6 a week to pay your water bill, £30 a week for your food, and so on. And you tot up what you think the absolute essentials are. It's not a load of liberal do-gooders doing that. It's like out of the focus group. And you do that and you get to a sort of basic benefit rate of £120 a week or something, rather than what even for older people is, by which I mean over 25, is £85. So you've got that big shortfall. And interestingly, you know, I've been on Conservative television programme with Julia Hartley-Brewer, and you spell out this argument and say which part of their water bill do you not want people to pay? And people don't argue with that. You know, there is a sense in which we're just too far behind. Those benefits are too far behind what's needed. And I think that the average person, the average voter, is starting to recognise that there's a gap there that needs to be filled.
Thank you all very much. It's time to wrap up now. I've got to be somewhere else. And so I tell you what, we've got another half an hour, at least an hour in here, or more. I mean, the dentistry shot, you're spot on, aren't you? Blow my neck. So, sorry we've got to cut it short. It's been illuminating, it's been interesting, because of the contributions from you all and from the panellists. The debate about minimum basic income is a growing one, isn't it? And that is very, very interesting. And cost of living, my observation is that it's going to be a big, big theme as we head careering towards the next general election. It's going to be on us before we know it. Thank you all so much for your contributions. Thank you for coming. Allow me to chair this. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you to the panel. Round of applause for all of you, please.